Good morning. Happy Monday, everybody. It's good to see or good to hear from you guys in the chat. I hope you had a great weekend and are ready to get going. Um, as always, you can let me know that you're here in the chat. Ask me any questions that you may have. And as you can see, we are getting started today with Unit 16, which is titled A Global Superpower Facing Change. And we're gonna get going basically with the election of 1976. Well done in chat with Grace and Haley, who both managed to get that song "Go Your Own Way" by Fleetwood Mac. Fleetwood Mac is really great. If you're looking for some old music to check out, I highly recommend it. The history project. So let's spend a few minutes before we get going into notes. Any questions that you have, please post them now about any part of this. It is due on Wednesday, Nick. So I appreciate the question. Due on Wednesday. Yep. If you have a partner you're working with, that's totally fine. I know fielded a few of those questions already. Howdy, Matthew. Howdy, Mary. Howdy, other Mary as well. Both Marys are here. That's great. Anybody else have any questions for me? I know I've been fielding a few questions in Google Classroom. So if there's any other question you have, whether it's now or during this entire time, please let me know. Remember, the rubric is posted on there. It's at the end of the presentations, or right before the Jeopardies, at least. Go on there and make sure you're getting everything done. I've had a few projects turned in that are not quite getting everything done there that we need. There's also a few people who have been. I assume most people who are at least here live aren't having these issues, but who are asking questions like, "What decade do we need to do?" Um, as I've said, it's your choice, 50s through 80s. You don't have to let me know beforehand. I did get that question. That's a totally fine question. No, you don't have to let me know. You could just choose one of those four. Whichever one interests you the most. So we've already basically talked about the 50s and 60s at this point. We're moving through the 70s right now. We're going to get into the 80s today. So we're going to be talking about President Carter and President Reagan today. Unit 16 is interesting one as it's basically going to bring us up to the year 2000, which is pretty cool. And there are only three total lessons. That does not mean there's going to be three lessons today. I've taken basically the first half of lesson one. They're really long, since whenever it only has a few lessons, that makes the lessons super long, like it did in the World War II unit we've already talked about. So we're going to be moving on with that today. Um, yes. Any other questions for me before we get going about projects or anything like that? So let me know, and I'll answer those as best I can. It looks like we have a decent bit of people who are joining us live, and everybody else, I assume you're watching right now on YouTube, so that's good too. Um, if you have any questions on you're watching this, bring them up either in the Zoom meeting or just message me, and I'll get those sorted out as best I can. Um, I hope your weekends have gone well. I'll hopefully hear a little bit more about them during our Zoom call today. But yeah, mine's been a bit boring. I've got Percy here with me. He's just been sitting here and he's been barking a lot today, so hopefully he doesn't interrupt us too much. Anyway, so Unit 16, a global superpower facing change. So we're really bringing this into modern modern times where your parents were absolutely alive for the stuff that we're going to be talking about going forward, or even if they were young or just about to be born, but they're alive. A lot of your parents were probably born during either the Carter or the Reagan years. So um, just keep that in mind as we're going forward. We're going to continue to face more and more modern issues. And as such, we're going to get into more and more modern political things. So, as I've done before, we're going to brush over some of the modern issues that we have that we're dealing with now and how they parallel to stuff that we're talking about in this unit. Um, Politically, you may have your own opinions, but you may still be forming your own opinions. That's totally fine. I just want to let you know we are going to be talking about that a little bit. It does not mean that we need to get into the discussions necessarily of who's right, who's wrong, all that kind of stuff. It's up for you to decide. Just be thinking about that as we're moving forward, because we're going to see a lot of parallels between President Reagan and our current president, President Trump, and some of that is very intentional on Trump's part to, liken back to him. But we'll take a look at that as we go forward. So our essential question for this unit, and we'll be talking about this going forward, is how should we handle conflict? Um, it's been a central theme that we've talked about this entire year, is what's the United States role in global conflict? What do we need to get involved with? How do we approach that? How do we approach handling dangerous situations in countries across the globe? When do we get involved? When do we stay out of it? And what is worth putting our troops' lives at risk? It's a question that is never going to be completely finished, be completely answered. It's something we're going to have to think about going forward. Do we write down the essential question? Yes, if you can, just real quick, just write that down. I didn't make it yellow. That's on me. Go ahead and write that down. How should we handle conflict? We're going to watch our intro video, as we always do, talking about the Gulf War. So that's something that is obviously very recent in the 90s, and still has an impact on many people today. Mute my mic so there's not the echo. Watch the video.
My name is Irene Sapi. I am a veteran from the Gulf War. In my civilian sector, I teach. I'm a professor, and I love mentoring, and I love working with my students. I have adult learners, and that is awesome. I can see their life and what they go through and pay it forward. Help them to achieve themselves like somebody helped me to become who I am today. When I went to active duty, the first assignment was to go to English school. They felt that officers from another ethnicity or another background, another culture, another language needed the language skills and also how to work in a culture that is American, very different from your own heritage. From that training in English school, I passed flying colors and everything else, and went to military intelligence school in Arizona. And after that, I went to the Gulf War. This was the first war after the Cold War. Cold War had just finished in Berlin Wall, had just calmed down. Now this is the first war in years.
In the news, the Iraqi invaders are meeting stiff resistance, but appear to be in control of Kuwait this morning. The U.S. considers military options and pushes for economic sanctions.
Now, U.S. have to encounter a big hurdle within the war, is to work to the diplomatic sanctions or really go to combat. I was a special security officer, and I work with telecommunications centers. And my job really as a special security officer is getting classified information through the net, understanding the classified information, label it, and then disseminate it as fast as I can. As a general staffer, you're able to work straight with the general and see all kinds of great leaders coming in and out and how the general make decisions. And that for me, as in a formative year as an officer, really impacted me to see how the general operates. We were in a war zone, and you can hear bombs constantly. As a matter of fact, the first days when the war came through, we were already in Saudi Arabia, and there was SCOTS alerts, and I can hear the SCOT missile alert that can be devastating. I think that every time we jump and went to a location, and remember, war is not static. You cannot stay in one area. You can continue to move, especially in convoys. So we will go where the general will go. And so every time the general moved to another location, we went with the general. And that for him to know what is the combat, he needs to be listening to everything. So we were right there in combat with him. We were stationed right there where the oil fields were burning, and every night the sky was always dark. The Valley of Death, which is all the vehicles where they were burned and everything else, and the exit when Iraqi were trying to leave, and some of them, they were stealing all kinds of stuff and leaving Kuwait. And, you actually smell all that. And the oil fields, you can see all the oil fields burning, and there was nothing you can do, all that oil being burned. I was there during the liberation, yes. It was awesome. I remember a little kid came, and it was a girl, and she looked at my uniform, and I told her that I was an American soldier, but I was from Puerto Rico. She was more confused. I said, "You mean that you're from Puerto Rico, and you are an American soldier, and you came here to save us?" Then she said, "You are awesome." And I said, "Yes, I'm from Puerto Rico." And she was so excited. I think I left the active duty in 1995, but I can continue being in the military through the reserves. So it was a decision made for family. In the reserve, I'm a colonel, I'm a chief of staff, and I'm able to then jump as a civilian and do my job and then go back into my uniform and go for duty. It's an honor to serve and to give back. I've been 26 years in the military and still married the same guy. So it can be done, and you can have children and you can work. It's just the same thing. It's just priorities. You gotta shift them and you gotta work as a team. As a professor and a teacher and a mentor and a coach, military have helped me a lot to have the discipline, to understand about prioritization of things, understanding people. I understand why people do certain things and don't judge them. Appreciate them for what they can give and then help them if they want to get the proper training or support so they can achieve themselves to the higher level.
You can see how that still shapes the lives of people to this day, how that's changed. I've just got a question. Do we have an assignment for today? I meant to address that earlier. We do not have an assignment for today or anything extra for Wednesday. However, you need to make sure you are taking your notes and paying attention and getting this all down, because this will be part of a slightly longer assignment that I will be giving out next week. So just because we don't have an assignment that is over this stuff today doesn't mean that it's not important to know. You still have to pay attention, get the notes down. There will be questions about this later. Okay. On Monday, there will be, I'm probably going to make a 10-question assignment that kind of covers not only what we do that day, but what we did today, what we're going to do on Wednesday. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. I want to make sure you have plenty of time to get your assignment, your project done. That's totally fine. Melissa, you just joined late. Well, good to see you. No big deal. It's totally fine. If you have any questions about anything, let me know. We're just getting going. All right. So our first lesson is called the Conservative Revolution. We're going to take a look at how the Republican Party became more or less what it is today, and what that did to politics in America. What values were important for individuals, and how that changed the look of Washington. And of course, this is all centered around this man right here, Ronald Reagan, our 40th president. We're going to take a look at what he did, how he was able to gain influence, and what kind of legacy he began to leave behind. We're not going to cover everything about Reagan today. We're just going to talk a little bit about economics and his style of speaking. So, the election of 1976. Remember, the last thing we talked about was Watergate, that huge scandal that ended up with Nixon resigning from office and Gerald Ford becoming president. So, in 76, which is the next election after that, Ford is chosen as the Republican nominee, while Jimmy Carter is chosen as the nominee for the Democrats. Ford, of course, we've already talked about this. He was pretty unpopular, and the main reason why he had lost popularity were three different things. Number one, pardoning of Nixon. That entire situation obviously resulted in his popularity, plummeting. He was not a popular person. People wanted to see Nixon held accountable for his actions, especially on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, they had just lost faith in Ford, and of course, you have a few other things. You have the fall of South Vietnam. We talked a little bit about that. The complete, and at this point, Americans are faced with the reality that the lives that they lost in Vietnam and the effort they put in didn't result in an American victory. They had fought hard as best they can, but it ended up not working out for them, and so that obviously that made Ford look bad as well. And then the economy was still not in a good spot. So all of these combined led to Carter being the favorite, and Carter, of course, plays up the fact that he had not been working in Washington. He was the former governor of Georgia. he was a Washington outsider. He had not been part of the scandals that had been going on, and Americans agreed with this line of thinking that they needed a completely fresh face in Washington to kind of clear the air, and it ends up and Carter ends up winning the presidency after a close round of debates with Ford. Ford does well there, and it brings a pretty close, one of the closer elections that we're going to look at during this time. As you can see, I know I'm covering part of it, but pretty even split in terms of overall states. Um, but Carter is able to win some of the larger states like New York and Texas and Florida. I know you can't see that, but on there, but ends up winning those and wins the overall election. Jimmy Carter, if you don't know a whole lot about him, he's still very much alive today. He is quite old. I believe he's in his 90s at this point. He still lives in Georgia. Um, and he becomes our 39th president. Now, part of the thing you still need to remember, Republicans overall before the Watergate scandal were rising in popularity, and they still had a lot of influence on the in Congress at this time. And Carter had a difficult time working with them. He wasn't exactly well liked by a lot of members of Congress. He had difficulty navigating the system, getting things done, and he struggled to get a lot of his ideas and legislation passed in Congress, especially during his the beginning of his tenure. It eventually gets some things passed through, as all presidents are able to do, but no big changes that he was perhaps hoping to accomplish. He actually instead turns to some more conservative measures to help combat inflation by reducing credit and raising interest rates, working alongside both parties as best he can. But you can see that even with a Democrat in office at this time, you have a slightly more conservative policies and values being emphasized at this time. Carter also does another thing that is generally a conservative idea, which is the deregulation of the transportation industry. So removing some of the government's influence over that and letting the free market do what it's going to. It allows for people to kind of set a market rate so that the consumers generally are going to benefit at least somewhat over this, and it's money that the government does not have to spend. And certainly the businesses are going to benefit over that. Those who have the most influence over this, but both parties were in agreement on this, and that takes a step forward. However, through all this effort, through everything that he put forth, inflation was still growing, and popular. And Carter was not a popular president at any point throughout his entire administration. American people were forced to choose in the election of 1960 between two people that were not necessarily the most popular nationwide. Neither was looked at as an excellent choice, as somebody they could rally behind. So Carter ends up winning here, but the beginning of his administration is just kind of stalls out. He doesn't make a whole lot of progress, and we're going to take a look at what happens now to further sink his chances in 1980. And that's going to be all centered around the Iran hostage crisis. So, in 1979, the Iranian Revolution forced the U.S. backed Shah of Iran to flee, and Ayatollah Khomeini takes control in Iran. Now, what you need to understand is that the Shah of Iran before 79 was backed by America. They had supported him, and not a whole lot of Iranians loved the United States, they had a pretty decent working relationship. Things were rather diplomatic between the two countries, and nowhere near as contentious as they are even to this day. And this is really the point where the relations begin to change, and they become this constant back and forth between the two countries. Um, you have Ayatollah Khomeini, who takes power and hates the United States. And when President Carter allows the Shah of Iran to enter into America for the purposes of medical treatment, um, the Ayatollah takes um, exception to that. He's really upset, and as a kind of response, a whole bunch of revolutionaries storm the U.S. embassy and take 53 Americans hostage for basically the world to see. Now everybody is aware of the situation, and it becomes an extremely difficult process for Carter to get those citizens returned without causing a new global conflict. What also happens with this is Iran begins to have to fall in their oil production as the country is undergoing a complete upheaval, and their conflicts, of course, spiral out to countries around. And as you probably know, the Middle East is one of the biggest producers of oil in the world, and with their supplies beginning to run low and not being able to be distributed across the world, the United States and other countries begin to suffer an oil crisis. And they don't have easy access to things like gasoline in the United States. And while there's obviously a complex political situation going on, who's going to take the brunt of this? I mean, if there's a global crisis, even if you're doing everything you can, who's going to feel the heat of it? It's always going to be the leader in charge. And and there's certainly arguments to be made against Carter that he wasn't necessarily doing enough, and he was reckless with some of the decisions he made, was not doing enough for the economy. But a lot of the times, and we've learned this throughout the entire year, sometimes just the president's popularity is based on stuff that's not always in their control. Um, and that kind of goes to reflect on Carter in this situation. And by 1980, obviously the economy is still struggling. Energy crisis is gripping onto has taken a grip on America. Hostages in Iran are still out there. He's not been able to secure their safe release even a year later after these events happen. So he's really, really low in popularity. Take a look at that picture up in the top right. You can see lines just going for almost miles in some in some places that of cars just backed up waiting to get whatever sources of gas they can. I mean, think about how life would be vastly different today if we had this type of this gasoline crisis. Obviously, literally today, it's not that different. I hopefully nobody's traveling too terribly far, but on a regular basis, especially in a city like Houston, how far do we have to travel to get from school to home, from home to work, and from everything? So it changed the way that America was able to function. You really had to start thinking about, can we afford to take a trip right now to just go out and have some fun? Can we afford to take a trip to go and see relatives somewhere else? We've had gas crises, but sorry, we've had like miniature gas crises before. Think back to some of the recent hurricanes. People were certainly worried about how they were going to be able to get gas, and that was more in Ike and Rita before Harvey. But I think back to Hurricane Rita, which was, I know, 2005. So most of you were either just born or not born yet. But basically, there were lines for normal gas stations that would stretch out for hundreds of cars, all lining up to go to these places. It changed the way everything was running. It really, and obviously, it reflects very, very poorly on the president at the time. Guess who was president in 2005? George W. Bush. Not exactly the most popular president by the time he was out of office. Probably for other reasons, but still. All right. So, with all of this going on and the unpopularity of Carter and the Democratic Party, many Americans began to believe that high taxes and big government were causing national problems. Who's ever heard that before? I imagine many of you have heard that kind of sentiment before, either at home from other people, causing national problems, high taxes, all of that, the big issue. The federal government had grown steadily since the 30s. Can I go back a slide? Absolutely. I'll still talk about this, but the government had been growing since the 1930s. And of course, that when you think back to the 30s, you should be thinking Great Depression. And that's really when stuff started to change. We talked about this. You guys wrote a big essay on it about what the government's supposed to do in these types of situations. And in the 1930s, big government programs have been put into place by FDR, and a lot of those had stayed in place or grown and changed into something else. The government had continued to grow and grow and grow. You think back to Lyndon B. Johnson; he put in a lot of programs into place as well. Continued to constantly grow the government into something much bigger than it was like in 1920. Much more, the government held more power. The government held more influence. Dealt with a lot more over the lives of the citizens. And people were a little bit tired of that. They didn't think that the federal government needed to be the ones making all of these big decisions. Instead, they were far more partial to being governed by the state governments. And that makes a lot of sense for a few reasons. First of all, who knows you better? Who knows the problems of its people better? The big federal government or the state government? If you're dealing with issues, in your community, would you rather write to the mayor or the president? Who do you think is going to get stuff done? So there's this kind of thought that, you know what, we can rely on our local city and state governments instead of the federal government. That can be a little bit smaller and still take care of the issues that it needs to, but it doesn't put as much control over every single person. Instead, we can have our own values and our own laws that are decided by the people who know us best. Well, Will, you good? Can I go forward? I'm going to go forward. Okay, good. All right, awesome. So you have this movement, as I was saying, to kind of go back to a more conservative approach to all of this. Conservatives begin to dominate the Republican Party. That becomes the new norm for many people. And they call for a return to traditional values such as religion, family, patriotism, all things that were held dear for a long time, but they thought had begun to be a little bit lost, especially in the political sphere. And they called for a return to that. You can see we have that chart up there. It's a little hard to read, so I'll read it out for you guys about conservative goals. So 6 different things. First of all, cut spending on social programs. A lot of people did not like the way that they were working, or that they were being implemented. Some said they were being abused by people who were not, acting for the betterment of the country. 2, return to traditional values. We just talked about that. Religion, family, patriotism. We know what all of those are, and hopefully, you have had we've talked about why those can be so important. Reduce regulations on business, number 3. So the idea with reducing regulations, such as things like environmental restrictions, was to hopefully allow the businesses to continue to produce at the rates that are best for them. And for the standpoint of the economy, it's certainly worked out very well. It leads to a big boom. We'll talk about that in a bit. 4, lower taxes. They believe that having money in the pockets of citizens leads to a healthier economy, more spending and more money flowing. 5, reducing size of the federal government. We talked about that. And 6, balancing the federal budget. So that's an important thing as well, making sure that our country is not going constantly into debt. We'll see how well they were able to accomplish these things in the future, but those were what they set out to accomplish with this new movement. You have people like Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater leading the movement against the large government trend in the 60s and the 70s. Became kind of this face for new conservative Republicans. Then you have Reverend Jerry Falwell founding the Moral Majority, which was basically a group to help support political candidates who favor conservative religious goals like prayer in schools. You can go on. And they end up supporting candidates who support these values. One of those was Ronald Reagan. So he ends up becoming another face of this brand new Republican movement. All right, are we good? Unless I hear something, I'm going to keep going. So now we move on to the election of 1980. A few things that you see here. Obviously, the button up there, the Reagan and Bush "Let's Make America Great Again" was their campaign slogan in 1980. Where have we ever heard that? But by 1980, most voters in most states were tired of failed policies and they wanted change. They saw the economy not basically stagnant. They did not trust Jimmy Carter in terms of diplomatic relations, and Reagan and Bush promised a new way of operating. And obviously, we talked about a lot of those new Republican values, which they embodied. So, as I said, Carter's failures to turn the economy around and secure a safe return of hostages in Iran made him unpopular. And so, movie star turned politician Ronald Reagan had become a very popular figure in the Republican Party. He was extremely well liked. Obviously, he had charisma that was basically unmatched by politicians at the time. He had a great ability for public speaking, earns him the nickname the Great Communicator. And we're going to talk about how he was able to do that. We're going to watch some videos of him speaking and just how he was able to endear himself to Americans across the country. Take a look at that political map. I know I'm covering up a little bit of it, but Florida goes Republican here. Georgia goes Democrat, and Alabama goes Republican. From what you can see only a handful of states end up going Democrat, as a incumbent is basically loses in a landslide. That's not very common. Just goes to show you what the public opinion of Jimmy Carter was at the time. Obviously, that's changed today. Now he's a pretty popular person. He still works on building houses for the homeless. He has a great care for like human rights and all that kind of stuff. He's a pretty stand up guy, and now he's well respected by both sides, even if they didn't necessarily love him as president. And sometimes that's important to remember, especially after these people are out of office. Is how are they still helping the community? So I know there's a lot of notes on this page, so I've been waiting for a little bit. But let's think about some immediate parallels from Reagan to Trump today. And obviously, the biggest one, how about that slogan? Instead of "Let's Make America Great Again," Trump goes with "Make America Great Again." You're talking about somebody who was a celebrity, a well-known public figure, who then decides to switch to politics. So that kind of there's that similarity. Both Reagan and Trump are the oldest presidents to ever serve. And if you didn't know, whoever wins the election of 2020, assuming it's one of the two frontrunners right now, will be the oldest president ever elected, ever to win an election. Yeah, Reagan wins in after Reagan wins in '84. By the end, he is older than Trump is right now, or Biden is right now. But in '84, he was younger than either of them will be this year in 2020. So just something to keep in mind. So older figure again, and but one big difference is that Reagan is able to use his public speaking to reach out to everybody. And what he does is he uses humor to his advantage, to endear himself to the public, to kind of make everybody on both sides really kind of smile and enjoy listening to him talk. And that does wonders for your your ability to rise politically, because everybody really ends up supporting the person that they can look at and
March 30th, 1981.
Enjoy listening to. All right, sorry about that. we're going to take a look here at a video of some of Reagan's best one-liners and how he uses humor to score political points to the benefit of, his agenda and what he's trying to get out there. So we're going to take a look. Hopefully you can enjoy some of these. They're pretty funny. And then we'll watch one other shorter video with, I've probably already talked about it in some classes, but I think it's worth watching.
Mr. President.
John Hinckley Jr. fires 6 shots at President Ronald Reagan. A bullet lodges an inch away from his heart. Reagan is rushed into the operating room and tells his doctors, "I hope you're all Republicans."
Presenting to you the President of the United States.
Our 40th president survived, of course. And besides his toughness, the shooting showed the American people that the great communicator also had quite a sense of humor.
Letter came from Peter Sweeney. He's in the 2nd grade in the Riverside School in Rockville Center. And he said, "I hope you get well quick, or you might have to make a speech in your pajamas."
Throughout his political career, Reagan used humor to win friends, influence voters,
You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your
and
staff-
slay the opposition. No one knew that better than Democratic challenger Walter Mondale.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
You wanted law and order in this town. You've got it.
A former Hollywood actor and spokesman for General Electric, Reagan knew how to make his humor seem off the cuff, except that it wasn't.
Mike Devers, in his book, said that I had a short attention span. Well, I was going to reply to that, but oh, what the hell, let's move on to something else.
You can talk to any number of President Reagan's speechwriters over the years, and when they might hand him a speech, sometimes the speeches would come back with a quote or an expression or a joke that they hadn't seen before.
Turns out the Gipper had a secret comedic weapon, says John Highbush, executive director of the Reagan Library. So all of this is the contents of his desk, the last desk he used.
2 boxes filled with the last objects sitting inside President Reagan's working desk.
Cool. All right, well, listen, I want to see this stuff. Buried inside one of these boxes, a stack of index cards.
The president's famous one-liners, his best jokes, written on both sides. This is the humor of Ronald Reagan in 3x5.
This one is titled One-Liners. Adolescence is the time when children suddenly feel responsible for answering the phone. It's pretty good. It's funny. As unassuming as these look, they were political dynamite, a war chest of jokes. Many he wrote himself, others he borrowed.
Someone has once said that actually, as long as there are final exams, there will be prayer in schools.
I can remember when a hot story broke and the reporters would run in yelling, "Stop the chisels."
We showed some of the jokes to comedian Drew Carey. Jokes about Congress.
I've wondered at times what the 10 Commandments would have looked like if Moses had run them through the U.S. Congress.
About the Soviet Union.
What are the 4 things wrong with Soviet agriculture? Spring, summer, autumn, and winter.
And about himself.
Just to show you, this is the best one.
Just show you how youthful I am, I intend to campaign in all 13 states.
He was a guy who wasn't afraid to make fun of himself, which was great. Like whatever you think the elephant in the room is, that's the thing you should be able to talk about and joke about. When I do the same thing, the first thing I do is I make a joke about the way I look.
And that kind of inoculates yourself.
Totally.
When I go in for a physical now, they no longer ask me how old I am. They just carbon date me.
Reagan's sunny disposition, his ability to joke about pretty much anything, long predated his career in politics, says his daughter, Patty Davis. She says it was a lifelong coping.
All right, we're going to cut it there. So as you can see, pretty funny. I don't know if you enjoyed those as much as I did, but clearly he uses that for his political, to gain political points and for, he he is obviously very, very likable from both sides. Like, you can watch that presidential debate that they showed a clip of there, and the whole quote about his opponent's youth and inexperience, and it gets his opponent to laugh. Can you imagine what debates could be like, even today with that kind of back and forth? They were not as, heated and contentious. They're two people who are working for the betterment of America, and it kind of just endears him to the public, and certainly, um, it makes him an extremely likable person. Now, what we saw there at the very beginning is an early assassination attempt on Reagan. He shot I think about a month or like 2 months into his term as president. It comes very close to his heart, but he manages to live. And this very short clip that I'm going to show you now is he's giving a speech in Berlin, and you're going to hear what he says. What he says when a balloon pops. And keep in mind, this is just like 2 months after he was shot.
By its very existence and character, Berlin remains the most compelling argument for an open world. We're reminded of the many traditions of openness and democracy that have marked the history of this city. America missed me.
So a balloon pops and missed me. It's just kind of a good example of how he was able to endear himself. And of course, that's one of the bigger differences between Reagan and Trump. We talked about some of the similarities, and we're going to continue to do so. Reagan has been able to use his humor to connect with everybody. That's not something that modern presidents have been able to use as much. Trump has not been able to use humor to kind of unite everybody. He's attempted occasionally, but not everybody kind of buys in. Obama tried to do that a little bit in his second term. You can look up some stuff that he did there, but he didn't use it at all his first term. Bush, not so much. But Reagan was able to do so, and gained a lot of popularity because of it. And you can see right up there at the top, that's the election in 1984. Almost a complete 100% sweep to Reagan. Only D.C. and Minnesota, where Walter Mondale's from, were able to win against went against Reagan. So we're just about done. I know we've gone a little bit. We've been going for a while now, but I think we're going to end with this slide. Reagan's first priority when he took office was his economic program that people like to nickname and call Reaganomics, because it was different than what the previous presidents have been doing. He cuts taxes, slows spending, does a lot of these same economic ideals as we see today. This idea that cutting taxes on people and businesses is going to lead to more businesses coming to America and faster economic growth. He slows spendings on some social programs that he feels are not working or are not necessary, again, allowing for these tax cuts and for more money, hopefully, for the government. Part of this, though, when he cuts these amount of taxes and these programs, is he kind of ends up leaving himself a little bit short in terms of overall deficit. We'll take a look at that graph probably tomorrow, or not tomorrow, Wednesday. But we'll see how the deficit was not really able to be handled during this time. But the economy ends up benefiting greatly from these innovations put in place. By 84, economy is booming. Reagan's extremely popular. The economy is doing extremely well, and that's why you see those election results. An absolutely overwhelming landslide in Reagan's favor, the kind that we really don't see from this point on. We'll take a look at 88. Bush wins pretty easily in 88, but every election after that ends up being a lot a lot more contentious. Today, we could not imagine having that kind of map for even 2020. Like, obviously, it's going to be another closely contested, another closely contentious election that's going to split the country all over the place. So we'll see. But this is only 40 years ago, or I guess this was 36 years ago, but it feels like forever, because it doesn't feel like we're ever going to be getting back to this this point anytime soon. We'll see. Obviously, we don't know which way the country's going to go. We may have some extremely popular candidates rise to the light, but part of the issues with the way things work today is everything that politicians say is recorded and kept up on, and then used years later to kind of break them down and to help have them lose their popularity. And you could say rightfully so, and that's totally fine. Like, obviously, people need to be accountable to what they said in the past. But you think about people like Joe Biden, about how he was torn down just in the primaries. We haven't even really gotten to the full election because of things that he said in the 70s and the 80s. So who knows if we'll ever be able to get to a point today where a candidate has a lot of support nationwide, and is able to turn a electoral map into something like that. And as I said, by 1988, 16 million more jobs had been created, while inflation had been held in check at the appropriate levels. We talked about how we some inflation is good. You don't want it to go in the other direction, and you don't want it to be hyperinflation. But inflation had been returned to a good, healthy level, and everything was going quite well by the end of Reagan's term. We'll talk a little bit more about diplomatic relationships, about Berlin Wall, that kind of stuff, with regard to Reagan in the next parts. But we're going to leave it off there. So if there's anything you need me to go back to see right now, let me know. If you're here joining me live. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to call it there. If you have any other questions about this, please let me know. Make sure you're taking down all these notes and are preparing for our assignments going into the future. Reminder, our Decades project is due on Wednesday. I do expect to see that day. So let me know if you have any questions about that as well. Bye, YouTube.